What's going on, guys? It's Rich here from the Millibit Tutorials, and today we are going to be going over Flask for web development. So if you don't know already, Flask is basically a way for you to create a website using Python. Flask itself is a web framework. I'll link this documentation below. It's very detailed. But in this tutorial, it's another no-BS tutorial, which again, that just means we're not going to be coding each line by line. Instead, we're going to be looking over a completed project using Flask, and I'll just explain to you what each thing does. Then you can click the link in the description to get all of the code, all of the notes, all of the resources for free in the link in the description. So before we even start this tutorial, I'd also like to point out I have a corresponding blog post on the millibit.com related to how you can create a Flask app. So this will also be in the link in the description. The purpose of this video is to just give you an idea of what Flask is and how you can use it, and basically show you through a finished project and try to give you the gist of what's going on. Without further ado, let's just jump straight into it, the no BS Flask tutorial. Start off, open up PyCharm. Let me show you the way this app works, a brief summary, and then I'll show you the way it's organized. So a summary. The way Flask works, you literally need to just import Flask at the top of your Python file. You can do whatever you need to do in the back end of your website using your Python file. And Flask contains its own web server, meaning once you run your Flask app, it automatically sets up a web server on your own computer so that you can visit your website by typing in like localhost :5000. It's the same way we type in www.facebook.com and that sends us to Facebook servers. We can set up our own local web server using Flask by running the Flask app in our Python code, and it sets up a local web server for us to basically test our website. That's a brief overview. Let's go over how the actual project is organized and then what the code does line by line. So let's start with how the project's organized. Take a look at this left-hand panel where my mouse is. Basically, there's just a folder, and I called it reference Flask project. You can call it whatever you want. This is where you're going to keep all of your files corresponding to this project. Within it, there are just two things. There's App.py, which is your main Python file, which I explained earlier. It's responsible for setting up a local web server and for having all of the functions and logic behind the website that actually makes the website work. And then we have another directory called templates. Okay, so templates contains your HTML page. If you're not familiar, HTML, again, it's used to actually display the page on the website. It contains, the attributes, the buttons, the forms, the actual stuff that the user sees, and then the things that the website does in the background, that happens in your app.py file. And then we will be talking about how we can link these two things together so that we can use Python to basically respond to something someone does when interacting with the HTML. So before we even get started, let me just show you what this HTML page looks like in real life. So not looking at the code, looking at visually what this page looks like. It looks like this. This is not the prettiest website, I know, but the point of this tutorial, again, is to quickly explain how you can do different things like interact with the UI and connect it to the backend very simply and set up the web server. So super simple website. All we have is two different rows. The first row contains a text that says value 1, and then a text field where you can type something in, and then a button. Second row contains another text field, and then a button. Okay, the reason why I have two text fields and buttons is because the first one we're going to handle using post requests. I'm going to explain to you what that is and how you can deal with that. And the second one we're going to use AJAX to actually separate our back end and our front end. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry about it. We're going to get in depth just in a second. So this is our HTML page. This is the website we're going to create. And again, this is not my website. This is just a reference to my HTML page right here. I'm not actually running any web servers, not running a website right now. And then in the future, I'll also have a tutorial about how you can upload your Flask app to something called Heroku, which I'll link that in the description as well. Heroku is a way for you to basically get your website running on someone else's servers so that you can visit it from any device. It doesn't have to be your own device running your own local web server. That's more complicated. That we'll get into in the future. So let's go back to PyCharm and try to understand what's going on. So again, this is the HTML page that corresponds to this file, which I just showed you. And now let's look at the Python. So before we get started, you're going to have to import Flask. If you haven't already installed Flask, you have to use pip to install it. The example of how you do that will be in the description below. I'm not going to go over the steps, but you just do pip install Flask. It's very simple. Then you can import it in your Python file, and then we do app equals Flask name, right? So this is basically saying that this file, this app.py file, will contain the main Flask app. This is the file that we're using to run basically our web server and to create our website. Then we have a couple of functions. I'll go over the functions in the future. And then the file goes to this if name equals main, which basically says if we are in this file, we're going to run our app. So app.run creates your web server locally and runs your website. So if I clicked run, notice how it says running on 127.0.0.1 :5000. That means that if I visit this link, if I copy it and I paste it, it goes to my website because it is running locally in this area. It's the same thing as doing http://google.com, except now it's running locally. So this is just basically an address to go locally to the web server. It creates that web server after doing app.run. So now let me explain to you how we can actually have logic in our app. We can do something called an app route. So, you know, in Python, you have functions and you can return values. In a Flask Python app, you have the same functions, but each function can correspond to a different route in your app. So for example, if you have www.google.com/hello versus /first versus /second, all of those different variations of what comes after the slash are different app routes. So in this case, if we navigate to whatever this link is, which is basically 127.0.0.1:5000 / it takes us to the main page because we're doing return render template, which basically renders an HTML page, and we're returning mypage.html. Does that make sense? We are returning the HTML page when you go to the / app route. Think of / as just with nothing, right? You're not putting anything next to it. Then we have another app route /. This means that this function will be invoked if we go to 127. Blah 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 /. Again, that's what it means. Then we have post method. But the difference between these two is that this one just contained app.route. This contains app.route, and it says methods equals post. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but it means if we receive a post method, which if you don't understand what that is right now, don't worry about it. Basically, it's something we're sending to our website from something else. If we receive a post method and we're on the /, then we're going to run the post method function. That's all there is to it. And then the last one, I'll explain to you in a bit. This one gets a little bit more complicated. So now that we understand what's going on, you can probably tell the reason why this HTML page displays when you type up 127.0.0.1 is because we're rendering our HTML page and we're returning that. Okay, so now let's look at the HTML page. Before we even look at this, I want to just point out a really easy hack. If you don't know how to code in HTML, you can search up HTML editor and you can just find one online. There's a bunch, and then anything that you type up on the left will transfer into code on the right. And so you know, if I bold text and I type in hi, then it comes up as strong in the code. And then you can just copy and paste your HTML from here into your code if you want to change your HTML. For this example, all the code's in the description anyway, so there's no point of you doing that. But I just wanted to point that out. Anyways, let's look at our HTML. So let's ignore all of this stuff for now. Okay, we're going to start off simple. We have a title that says I love the millibit up here, and then we have a form. A form is basically just a way for the user to interact with the website. So we have an input type that says value1, and the type is text, which is why we have something that says value1. It's literally just a text that says value1. Then we have input type submit. Okay, so submit, this is a button. We have a submit button here. So when you click the submit button, it's going to do something because that's what buttons do. And the method is post. So remember we were talking about post methods earlier. Basically, if you set up a form and you say form method equals post, that means whenever you click the submit button, it will send a post method to your website. So let's say I click submit. In my Python app, which again, this is the brains of the website. This is what's going on in the background. In my Python app, it will go to my app route. It's just / because I'm still on 127.0.0.1:5000 /, and then it will send a post method. So any functions that I set up with an app route that say methods equals post and the route is a /, it will invoke those methods. So it will invoke my post method. Well, what does post method do? Well, let's see. Post method says string received equals request dot form. Okay, so you're probably like, what the heck is request? Well, request is one of these things we imported earlier. It's basically a way for you to get a value from a post request. So we clicked post in our form, we clicked the submit button in our form, and we also had a way for you to enter a value in that same form, right? This little text box, you could enter a value in it. So now if we want to get the value of what the user typed in our post method, which gets invoked when you click the button, we just do request.form and then the name of what we want to get, value1. Again, value1 is what this was defined as. This text box is value1. So whatever I type in here, if I do request.form value1, I will get this text. Okay, and then what we do is we type in return. Again, what return does, return basically displays a page of whatever you're returning. So in the past, we did return an HTML page, so we were returning this HTML page, but now we're just going to return text. Then we do return string received, and if you're not familiar with .format, it basically puts whatever you put in the .format in the curly brace. We do string received, and then we print what the user put. So let me do that. Technically, if I type something in here, let's type in the millibit is awesome, and I click submit, it says string received, the millibit is awesome. Does that make sense? We're basically returning whatever the user typed into here, and we're getting that value through a post request from our HTML into our Python. Okay, so now let's think about how we can do the same thing in a different way. So now we're gonna do something else. Now, let's set up like a password. Let's set up a password where if you type in the word hello in this text box and then click the button, it redirects you to Google. But if you don't type in hello, then it displays an error. So the password is basically hello. Let's try to code that into our Flask app. So this approach, I'm trying to explain one essential concept, and that concept is creating a separate UI and a separate Python file, okay? So in this case, in the case that we just went over, our two elements weren't really separated. It was like you click the button, and then it interacts with the Python, and then the Python returns something new. But what I'm trying to explain to you with the second method, is how you can separate the UI with the code. In essence, everything that's being returned to the user should be returned from the HTML, and everything that's being processed should be processed from the Python, right? And you're probably wondering, well, what's the point of doing that? Well, the reason why I'm teaching this so early is because it's so important to understand how to separate the UI from the code. Because let's say you're creating a huge scalable application, and you want to be able to use the same logic, the same Python file that can use logic to make calculations, process things on multiple different platforms. You want to have an Android app, you want to have an iPhone app, and you want to have a website. Well, in that case, you can't just be changing the UI from your Python file, because your Python file is responsible for making calculations. You need to change the UI based on whatever UI you're using. If you're using an iPhone, you want to change the UI for the iPhone. If you're using an Android, you want to change the UI for the Android, right? You want to change the UI in whatever file is related to the UI, which in the case of a website is the HTML file. So now what we're going to do is try to keep the Python separate from the UI, meaning we're not going to return any sort of HTML page or string using Python. We're just going to return a value to our UI, which will then return a page. So if that's kind of confusing, we're going to go over it, and that'll hopefully clarify things. So basically, let's go back to our HTML page. We have a second form, or not a form, we have a second input with a button and another text field. Same format as the one above, it's just not in a form. And the reason it's not in a form is because we're not going to use a post request for this type of method. In this case, we're going to use an on-click function, meaning the moment the user clicks the button, it's going to invoke a method, a function called number2. You're probably wondering, where's this function? Where's this function that's going to be invoked? Well, it's in the HTML file itself in a script, right? So you can have JavaScript scripts in your HTML, which basically contain functions that process things within your HTML itself. So we have a script, okay? And ignore this line, ignore line 5 for now. I'll explain it later. We have a script called, it's a type of JavaScript, and then we have a function number2, right? Because again, on click, we invoke number2. Then what we do is we say the value that the user has typed in, which the user types in this text box, the value is equal to this value dot val. You're probably wondering, what is this value? Well, hashtag value2 refers to the ID of value, or the name of value2, which is basically this text box. So we're getting the value of whatever the user types in, and then we're creating a URL. Okay, so here's the process of what's going to happen. We just got the value. We just got the value of what the user typed in. Now we want to send this value to our Python code. We want our Python to process it. We want our Python to return a processed value, and then we want to display that processed value from our HTML file, because I told you earlier we're doing all of the displaying from our HTML file. So how do you do that? Well, we create a URL, and we call it Valuegetter. And then in our Python code, we create a function called Valuegetter with a URL of Valuegetter/value, which means if you type in 127.0.0.1:5000 /Valuegetter/some value, whatever this can be, it will invoke this function with a parameter of whatever this value is, which in this case is DSF, blah, blah, blah. So it will invoke this function with value as the parameter. So in this case, what we're doing is we're creating a URL of Valuegetter, and we're concatenating the value that the user entered into our URL. So now let's say the user enters I like cheese or something, right? It would take us to http://127.0.0.1:5000 /I like cheese. When you navigate to this website, it will take you to this Python file, and it will pass in I like cheese as the value. And then the Python file will do some processing on that file, on that value, and it will return a response. Does that make sense? We are basically taking a URL and we're passing a value into it, and then we're getting a response. We're not displaying a page from the Python file. We're just responding to a value. Okay, let's look at how we do that. So we do this thing called .getJSON, and this is what's called an AJAX function. So you don't need to worry too much about what AJAX is, but basically import this line. It's a script that allows you to use an AJAX function, which allows you to basically navigate to a different URL and get its response. So what we're doing is we're doing .getJSON URL. So we're passing in this website that I just told you about, the one that goes to I like cheese, and then we're getting a function response. Right, we're getting a response from our server. In this case, this function is our server. We're getting the response, and then what we're saying is, if the response is true, let's redirect the user to Google, and if it's false, let's just say the value is false. Okay, so we're using this function .getJSON to get our value that is returned from our Python function, and then we are basically putting some logic upon it and redirecting our user based on that value. And we're saying if we're not able to get a response from that website, like let's say we messed up the URL, or let's say our Python function is not working, we return the wrong value, we display an error in our console. Okay. And then we close the function. So let's understand what's actually happening here. We receive a value, right? We receive whatever we're receiving is the value that the user entered in the text box. So far, so good. If you don't understand up until this point, rewind the video and try to understand why this value contains I like cheese, because this value at this point contains I like cheese if the user has entered I like cheese and presses the button. Then we're saying if the string received, which in this case is I like cheese, if it equals hello, we return true because hello is our password. And if not, then we return false. Okay, and what this JSONify does is it basically says our key of response associates with our value of true. Okay, this is just convention. It's just a way to return the word true by corresponding it with the key of response. In this case, you're returning the word false by corresponding it with the key of response. Then you can access that by doing server response that associates with response, because response is the key, and it has an associated value that is either true or false. Okay, and then this response.header.add, don't worry about it. It's just convention that you need to do in order to make sure that the responses actually go through. So now let's actually check what's happening. Let's say I type in I like cheese, click value 2. I get value is incorrect because what happened was, let's go through the whole process flow. I typed in I like cheese, I clicked the button had an on click, which went to number 2. The number 2 passed in I like cheese into my URL of Valuegetter. And then we did this .get JSON thing, which basically gets the response from the server. The response from the server should be false because I like cheese is not equal to hello. And then we just say, well, since it's not true, if it's not true, we're going to display an alert that says incorrect. And that's exactly what happened, a result that says incorrect. Now let's say we type in hello and click value 2. Boom, it redirected to Google. Why? Because if server response, the value that is associated with the key of response equals true, well then we're going to read, this is just code that redirects you to Google. You don't need to understand it. It's just to make a point. It redirects you to Google. So that's basically 2 different ways you can connect to the UI with the code, one way using a post request and one way using AJAX. If that didn't make as much sense, please take a look at the blog post which describes it in depth, and the notes and the link in the description. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. Please leave a like, comment if you need help. I will respond to the comments.